Black Jamaicans caught more runaway slaves than Maroons for almost 100 years longer. Why are people mad at Maroons for catching runaway slaves when more Black Jamaicans hunted runaway slaves? In fact, there were more Black Jamaican slave hunters than there were Maroons. And they had been doing it for almost 100 years longer. I true them don't know nothing besides propaganda where white man teach them. Let's unpack this hypocrisy. But first, smash my like button. Share the video, comment and subscribe. Let's get into it. When a slave ran away, the first to be called to catch them were free blacks, people of color, slaves who worked as bounty hunters, both officially and unofficially. The Maroons lived in the jungle mountains of Jamaica. It would not make sense to trek all the way up there to call them down to catch a slave. Instead, they relied on both the enslaved and free blacks. On the plantation, slaves who caught slaves were referred to as drivers or trustees. Trustees and drivers would catch runaways from their own plantation in exchange for better treatment, often still remaining enslaved themselves. That's some hateful mess right there. It goes to show that misery does indeed love company. This is proof that most of us come from dirty crab in a barrel. All ancestors. I talk about Maroon catch slave. You know what your ancestor do, boy? Go look up all of the last name of people who catch slave. See if your name there before you come talk about Maroon catch slave. Take a look in a mirror. This mentality still plagues Jamaica today. Free blacks and people of color would respond to advertisements for runaways with reward money. Often, they would catch runaways who were hiding out on their property, but some made a job out of bounty hunting. For example, George Bulteel's agents. In 1718, advertisements often calling upon any persons to bring in runaways for rewards. Historical records show that free people of color often responded to these calls to gain legal standing or financial stability. Whereas documentation of Maroons catching runaways are greatly exaggerated, and they're not reliable because at the time, there was a fervent campaign to convince the newly freed blacks that the Maroons were loyal to the crown, to scare them into submission and prevent them from getting close to the Maroons. While documents list the names of blacks who caught slaves, the names of Maroons who caught slaves in the same document are never listed. Only that the Maroons did it, implying a monolith or an organized force devoted to doing this job, which never existed. The exclusion of names of the Maroons who were paid for catching slaves calls into question the validity of these documents, because 100 years before that, when the Maroons killed Three Finger Jack, we got the names of the Maroons that were involved in doing so. Historians argue that Fasual Fife used local groups in Jamaica and labeled them as Maroons to retroactively validate his position, and that he exaggerated the number of troops under him. He also could not provide any names for the Maroons who supposedly worked for him as he could for his actual soldiers. While I acknowledge that some Maroons did work as bounty hunters and caught runaways, it was no different than what Black Jamaicans had already been doing themselves for almost 100 years before the Maroon Treaty. In fact, there would be no treaty, nor even a Maroon War, if it had not been for the Black Shots. The Black Shots were free blacks and slaves who voluntarily signed up to hunt Maroons instead of joining them. And at this time, the Maroons were the runaway slaves who were fighting the main rebellion against the British. The best part of the British military was the Black Shots, and blacks made up 2/3 of their entire army. And I quote, "Let it be observed that the free Negroes and slaves that we have sent upon these parties acted their part much better than the white people, which proves my assertion. Indeed, the Maroons were never a unified monolith that agreed to catch runaways, and documentations of Maroons catching slaves are debatable. But what is not debatable are the names of the many black Jamaicans, free and bond, caught slaves. So if you hate Maroons, hate your papa and yourself, you hypocrite.